Well, it is entirely fitting for the speaker I'm about to introduce, my colleague and friend, Dr. Steve Evans, to deliver the first featured address at this interdisciplinary conference. For in many ways, the scholarly conversation we're here to take part in begins with Dr. Evans. I know Steve himself would immediately join Darren in thanking all those many names that he drew our attention to, the scholars, administrators, and staff who have made this topic, who have explored this topic before him, and who have made this conference possible. And there are indeed many to acknowledge, and I trust Darren will draw our attention to those in due course, many more to thank. But as Darren mentioned, this conference is hosted in partnership with a generous Templeton Religion Trust grant, which is devoted to exploring the concept of accountability and its place in a flourishing life in a multidisciplinary context. And Dr. Evans is the principal investigator on that grant. He and his associates have been engaged in this research since 2018, and the fruits of their labor are now taking shape in the form of numerous publications, not the least of which is Dr. Evans' forthcoming monograph, Living Accountably, Accountability as a Virtue, scheduled for publication with Oxford University Press in 2022. We can look forward not only to hearing from them about their research and from Steve in a few moments about his research, but in joining in the conversation with them, in a dialogue with them about this important concept of human flourishing, and especially about its importance in the Christian life, which is a topic we'll no doubt be hearing more about tonight as Dr. Evans draws a connection between the concept of the fear of the Lord and the virtue of accountability. The address we'll be hearing tonight and the larger research program I've just been alluding to, are the latest contributions of a distinguished scholarly life that is quite honestly intimidating and difficult to summarize in a brief introduction. It takes a CV of some 53 pages to sketch its basic outline. The forthcoming book that I just mentioned, by my count, is the 21st monograph, various ones of which have been translated into Chinese, Korean, Finnish, Macedonian, Spanish, Turkish, and Russian, and some into several of these. Kierkegaard's name figures in the title of at least 8 of these, which unquestionably makes Dr. Evans one of the world's foremost experts on this important Christian thinker. The other titles cover an astonishing variety of topics, range of topics, in the history of philosophy, ethics, philosophy of religion, philosophical and even biblical theology. I can personally recommend a number of Dr. Evans' works and have done so many times. My personal favorites include his recent History of Western Philosophy. I consider it the best contribution to this genre since Bertrand Russell's, and have recommended it to many friends. His Natural Signs and Knowledge of God from 2010 is another personal favorite for the new light it casts on the arguments of natural theology and their significance. In addition to all the monographs I've just mentioned, there are articles and book chapters and edited volumes, too many to mention in a time that's allotted to me. But I do not want to give the impression in this short introduction that Dr. Evans' terrific scholarly productivity has in any way overshadowed or outpaced his devotion to students, to the craft of teaching, to his commitment to professional service, and even to the work of academic administration, which he has labored in tirelessly at various points in his career. It is for these gifts, his gifts in these areas, as well as his scholarly work, that he's been decorated numerous times with professional awards, including most recently in 2018, the highest honor Baylor confers on a faculty member, the Cornelia Marshall Smith Professor of the Year Award. And it is similarly because of the totality of his contributions that Dr. Evans currently serves not only as the University Professor of Philosophy and the Humanities here at Baylor, a position he's held since 2001, but as a professorial fellow at the Logos Institute for Analytical and Exegetical Theology at St. Mary's Divinity College at the University of St. Andrews, and also as a senior fellow here at Baylor's Institute for the Studies of Religion, and as currently the director of Baylor's Center for Christian Philosophy. Among all these accomplishments and many more that I've not named, I think I am personally most appreciative of Steve's commitment to the cause of Christian scholarship, broadly understood. He's never lost sight of his calling as a Christian scholar to build up the intellectual life of the church. And this commitment shows itself not only in the topics Dr. Evans has devoted his scholarly attentions to, and the sort of address that we'll be hearing tonight in his interdisciplinary explorations of the Christian life, but also his willingness to undertake work that would go typically unnoticed in a CV as impressive as the one I've been describing here. His teaching of Sunday school courses, singing in the choir at the churches he has attended over the years, and for directing and contributing in small ways to the health of the Christian intellectual community abroad, including directing a dissertation currently at the Oxford Center for Mission Studies, which provides higher education opportunities for Christian leaders in Africa and Asia. It's for all these reasons that I consider it a great pleasure and an honor to get to describe his work to you and introduce him and welcome him to the stage to address us tonight on the topic of the virtue of accountability and the fear of the Lord. And I ask you to join me in welcoming him.
Well, I'm tempted to borrow a line from my friend and former teacher, Merrill Westfall. After that introduction, I heard Merrill say this at one point. I should ask the Lord to forgive Todd for maybe exaggerating just a bit, and me for enjoying it so much. I must begin with some thanks as well. When I first started thinking about doing a project on accountability 3 or 4 years ago and started to apply for the grant from the Templeton Religion Trust, one of the first things I thought is we got to have a major conference, and I want this to be done by Darren Davis and the Baylor Institute for Faith and Learning, because I know they know how to do conferences and they assemble a community like the community we have here. So I was so grateful when I broached this idea with Darren, and he immediately hooked up on this and say, yeah, that's a great idea, and here we are tonight. This is really the fulfillment of a dream for me. So let me thank all of you for coming and making it a reality. Not too many months ago, I was beginning to doubt whether this would happen, and here we are. So thanks. I also have to thank I have a large team who's worked on this grant with me, and I want to begin by acknowledging their help. I won't ask them to take responsibility for anything I say tonight, but I have to say that a lot of what I say I couldn't have said if I hadn't learned what I've learned from them and what we have learned together in conversation. So let me just thank Byron Johnson and Sung Jun Jang, Charlotte Whitfleet, Andrew Torrance, who can't be here because he's in Scotland and the U.S. government won't allow anybody in yet, Robert Roberts, Joseph Lehman, Matt Bradshaw, Brandon Rickabaugh, and Brendan Case, who were formerly part of the team. Thank you to all of you. It's been such a wonderful time together to get to know you better and work with you all, and I think together we're going to produce some really interesting and good work. So let me get going. The fear of the Lord and the virtue of accountability. I should also say I have at least one old slide here which has a bad date on it, but you won't know that if you're not on the first row. I should think I'm a technological Luddite, and I wouldn't know anything about PowerPoint or be able to create a slide if my life depended on it, but I had help from a couple of graduate students, so thank you to Sievert Ellingson as well. It's fundamental to Christian faith, as well as Judaism, to see human beings as accountable to God. Christians believe not only in a last judgment, we believe that all humans live their lives before God. Recently, Christian ethics, as well as ethics in general, has taken a stronger interest in the virtues. However, there's been little or no attention given to the idea that there might be a virtue that is connected to our human responsibility to God. I believe there is such a virtue. I propose to call it accountability, admittedly using this term in a somewhat novel way. The virtue of accountability is not restricted to accountability to God, although this, I think, is one of its most important, maybe the most important instance. Rather, it's a virtue that can be present in many human relationships. It's present in a person who embraces being held accountable, recognizes that at least under certain conditions, being accountable is a boon or a gift. The word accountability normally denotes a state of affairs in which someone, call this party the accountee, is responsible to someone else, call this person the accounter. The accounter has the authority or standing to expect or require certain actions of the accountee. And those actions include giving an account as to how well the accountee has fulfilled the underlying expectations. Normally, therefore, when there is accountability, there is both accountability to someone and accountability for something. Both the roles of the accounter and the accountee are ones that can be carried out well or poorly. I propose that someone who fulfills either role with excellence has a virtue, maybe a set of virtues. Tonight I'm going to focus mainly on the virtues of the accountee, the person who is accountable. Now, I recognize the term accountability is not normally used as a virtue term. More frequently, the term is used to denote the process of assigning responsibility to someone who thereby experiences the consequences of this assignment or his judgment. Thus understood, we talk a lot in our society about accountability. We talk about holding politicians accountable. We argue about whether teachers should be held accountable for student learning. In business, employees are held accountable by supervisors, and executives are, sometimes at least, accountable to the boards. However, accountability is not limited to hierarchical relationships. There's also a sense in which teachers are accountable to their students and executives to their employees. And I think there is also a sense in which humans as humans are accountable to each other. Although accountability we owe to other humans is very important, I want to emphasize the fundamental nature of accountability to God, at least from the Christian perspective. The Christian scriptures tell us that each and every person is accountable to God for their whole lives. In Hebrews 4, Christians are told that nothing in all creation is hidden from God's sight. Everything is uncovered and laid bare before the eyes of Him to whom we must give an account. That we all live before God is obviously central to Christian faith, but sometimes we overlook the importance of what is central and obvious even. Although Christianity teaches that all humans are in fact accountable to God, it's obvious not all of us live our lives in a conscious way that echoes this truth. Perhaps few of us recognize the importance of this on a daily basis. The virtue of accountability to God, I think, is connected to the gaining of this kind of consciousness. Søren Kierkegaard said, and you all knew I had to mention Kierkegaard at least once tonight. Søren Kierkegaard said near the end of his life that he had tried to live his whole life in such a way as to show that God exists. I believe all of us should try to do the same. Now, frequently we use the term accountability with negative connotations. To hold someone accountable often simply means to be able to punish or sanction someone for failing to do what's required or expected. It's therefore not surprising that the term accountability is often viewed negatively as something people want to avoid. Most people want to avoid punishment. In order to understand the virtue of accountability and grasp its importance, we need to change this way of thinking. We need to see that when we are accountable to someone who has legitimate standing, and when this person exercises that standing in the right way for good purposes, including perhaps our own good, then being accountable is something to be thankful for. Much of what we call virtue ethics is derived from ancient Greek philosophers who gave us standard lists of virtues featuring such traits as wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance. Accountability doesn't seem to appear on such lists, and thus we might doubt whether there really is a virtue of accountability. Though I shall suggest later the Greeks did recognize accountability, but under a different name. However, perhaps we ought to look not merely to the Greeks when we're asking about virtues, but also to the ancient Hebrews. In the Hebrew Bible, we don't really encounter the term accountability very much either, but there is much reference, especially in the Old Testament, to the fear of the Lord, understood not only as a virtue, but a central virtue, since it is said to be the foundation or beginning of wisdom. But what is the fear of the Lord? My suggestion is that it's not to be understood literally as being afraid of God, but a reverent respect for God as the one to whom we are accountable. The person who has this virtue recognizes, or should recognize, being accountable to God as a gift. The fear of the Lord is the key to wisdom because it gives us the right perspective on ourselves and on our lives. This is why the psalmist could rejoice in God's law in Psalm 119. It's both good to be accountable to God and good to be accountable for keeping God's law, which is given to us as a gift, a guide to right living. Now, to be sure, ancient Israel learned that they could not keep God's law, and this is a lesson we continually learn as well. This teaches us that we need not only God's law, but God's grace, mercy, and forgiveness to live well and be rightly related to God. Still, God's rule over us is not a burden, but a gift. Since God himself is completely good, God wants us to flourish as his creatures and be all that he created us to be. To think of accountability as a virtue, we must then not focus on holding people accountable for past behavior. Rather, the virtue of accountability, like other virtues, is a responsive, forward-looking trait. It's the quality of people who see the condition of accountability as a boon and welcome it. They are answerable, they are transparent, they are honest about their behavior. They adjust their efforts based on feedback. They want to be accountable to do their best. They see that they improve by being held accountable. People who have this trait will also have the capacity to take the perspective of others. They'll have empathy. They will exhibit conscientiousness as they care about doing what's right. They will be able to respond to feedback. They recognize accountability in the sense of a condition or relation as a fundamental feature of human life. The virtue is present when they take this feature seriously and respond to it appropriately. Why think this trait is a virtue? Why think it's positively connected to human flourishing? A major reason is that we humans are fundamentally social creatures. So it makes sense that our flourishing requires relationships involving accountability, including mutual accountability. If accountability, including accountability to God, is a virtue, then this, I think, has empirical implications. Reason we had an interdisciplinary team. Virtues are traits that manifest themselves in human life and are recognized as valuable, at least by some people. If accountability is an important virtue, then those who have the virtue will tend to flourish compared to people who do not exhibit this trait. Good people recognize that a genuine human life is not simply a quest by individuals to maximize pleasures and minimize pains. Rather, healthy humans recognize obligations to care about other people and about their world. The virtue I'm calling accountability is found in those who care deeply about all these obligations, take seriously in their day-to-day lives the idea that they are accountable for how they live. Well, it's one thing to possess a trait and another thing to manifest that trait at some specific time and place. When a virtue is relational, as accountability is, just like gratitude and forgiveness, there are going to be objective conditions that must be present in order for the virtue to be episodically exemplified. For example, you can't be properly grateful unless you've been given a gift. Similarly, you can't really forgive unless you've been wronged. Accountability has similar objective conditions that must be realized for the virtue to show itself. Some concern the person to whom one is accountable, some concern the end or telos of the activity, and some concern the person who is accountable. Here are just a few of the conditions I think are necessary or at least helpful for this trait to be exemplified. 1. The person to whom one is accountable must have proper authority or standing, because a central motivational feature of the virtue is the recognition of this standing and a desire to give to the person with standing what is his or her due. One cannot be properly accountable to a bully or someone exerting power. This means, and this may be a little surprising, that fear of punishment is not at all central to the virtue of accountability. Punishment or sanctions may play a role in accountability. It may provide what I would call backup motivation, but the one who really has the virtue of accountability wants to satisfy the accountor because the accountee recognizes what is owed to the accountor. It's not fear of punishment that's motivating. Secondly, the person to whom one is accountable should be exercising their authority or standing in a legitimate way. When a person I'm accountable to makes inappropriate demands, I ought to question or resist this presumptuousness if I really have the virtue of accountability. 3, the goal of the activity should be something good. You can imagine being accountable for successfully carrying out a contract murder, but it would hardly be virtuous. 4, the person to whom one is accountable ideally should care about the good of the person held accountable. If I don't believe the person to whom I'm accountable cares for me and my good, it will be hard for me to embrace or welcome the relationship. If I'm accountable to a boss who wants to use me or exploit me or simply wants to see me fail, I will not welcome being accountable. Finally, the person to whom one is accountable should ideally have some competence with respect to the underlying relevant activity. If the person exercising authority is not very competent, the feedback or evaluation of such a person will not be of very much value. So how is the virtue of accountability related to other virtues? If accountability is a genuine virtue, it should not just be identical to some other virtue. For example, someone might think that what I'm calling accountability is simply what psychologists call conscientiousness, the trait of those who are sensitive to their obligations and who try hard to fulfill them. However, I think if we reflect on this, it's not hard to see that these two traits are not identical, even if they are correlated. It's easy to imagine a person who's highly conscientious, who even takes great pride in this conscientiousness, but who dislikes and perhaps even resents being accountable to others. Maybe thinking in a condescending way that accountability is something needed by people who are moral inferiors, but not by highly good people like me. Nor is accountability identical simply to being a sociable person who wants to please others. A people pleaser is someone who wants to be liked, but such a person is not necessarily focused on satisfying the legitimate expectations of those who have proper standing or authority. Now, one might think, and I've heard this objection several times, that accountability is not a single distinctive virtue, but rather a cluster of traits that enable a person to play the role of accountee with excellence. And this view, I think, does have some plausibility. Certainly, one is not likely to have the virtue of accountability without having a number of other virtues, and I will say something about those other ones in just a minute. But even if accountability is not a single trait, but a cluster of traits, it may still be helpful for us to have a name for the cluster. This may make it possible to recognize exemplars who have this cluster of traits. It may facilitate moral education with children and others who need to learn what it means to be accountable in an excellent way to others. On my view, the primary function of our virtue language is not to allow us to develop a precise and elegant theory of the virtues. It's to help us become better people. If that's right, then the case for talking about accountable people or people who live accountably will rest on the usefulness of such talk in helping us become the kinds of people we need to become. My own view is that the virtue of accountability is closely tied to the personal virtue the ancient Greeks called justice, which was broadly understood in Greek culture as giving others what is due to them or what is owed to them. In modern philosophy and contemporary philosophy, there's been a tendency to see justice more as a condition of a society or state, one which has well-ordered laws. However, to the ancient Greeks, justice was also a personal virtue. For Plato, this personal virtue was a master virtue, possessed by those who had such other virtues as wisdom, courage, and temperance. If accountability is linked to justice, if it's in some way a part of justice or connected to justice, then I think it's wrong to say this virtue was ignored by the Greeks. If there is a link to justice, accountability may still not be the same thing simply as justice in general. If justice is a master virtue, as I think it is, it may have several sub-virtues, and accountability plausibly is one of them, along with virtues such as honesty in one's financial dealings and truthfulness in one's conversation, which are also forms of giving others what is their due. We find it helpful to have names for honesty and truthfulness as virtues, even if they are aspects of justice, and I think the same is true for accountability. Although I don't myself think accountability is identical to another virtue or group of virtues, I think it is true that a person who has a high degree of accountability as a virtue must have a number of other virtues as well, including humility, the right kind of pride, honesty, and empathy. Humility is necessary because an arrogant or proud or self-centered person will just find it hard to accept being accountable to others. Recognizing our need of others is humbling. In one sense of the word pride, pride may also be helpful as a virtue. In the Christian tradition, pride has usually been seen as a vice, but Robert Roberts, even earlier today in some of his writings, has argued that there is also a kind of pride that is virtuous. People who have pride in this sense value their own worth and significance as creatures made in God's image. And pride in this sense may be helpful in distinguishing the virtue of accountability from the vice of servility, in which a person fails to recognize and appreciate their own value and worth, and as a result is overly deferential to others. Honesty is clearly a necessary aid to accountability. A person who is habitually dishonest, either self-deceived or dishonest to others, will certainly not be able to give accurate, helpful accounts to anyone. Empathy will also be valuable because to give others what is their due, one must be able to recognize what is their due, understanding the expectations, the rightful expectations of accounters. So where and when has accountability been recognized as a virtue, both in other cultures and in ours? I believe it has been widely recognized, though not always under that name. And the name is not important, it's the thing that's important. I've already suggested the ancient Hebrews had this idea of a virtue of accountability, but they called it the fear of the Lord, and that's an instance. However, the Hebrews understood this quality could also be exercised towards others in authority. One should not only fear God, but also the king. And perhaps the commandment in the Decalogue to honor one's father and mother could be understood as an admonition to give to one's parents the respect they are owed. I've also suggested that the Greeks recognize something that is the equivalent of the virtue as an aspect of justice, understood as the personal virtue in which one gives to others what is their due. This definition of justice as a virtue, as stated by Ulpian, was codified in Justinian's Digest, a kind of summary of the wisdom of the ancient world, and it exercised a profound influence on philosophy throughout the Middle Ages. Thomas Aquinas, for example, recognized a virtue that he termed obedience, in which he saw as one of a number of sub-virtues of justice. Someone who has the virtue of obedience, according to Aquinas, is not motivated to obey by fear of punishment, but by a desire to do what is right. The one who has the virtue is prompt and willing to act on a precept, even if that precept stems from the will of another, because that other is a person who has proper authority. A recognition of a virtue like accountability is not limited to Western cultures either. I believe that the Confucian virtue of filial piety, which plays a very foundational role in Confucian ethics, is also similar to what I'm calling accountability. One might wonder at this point if the virtue of accountability is only applicable to traditional societies like those of the ancient Hebrews or the ancient Chinese that place value on hierarchical relationships. If so, this would raise questions about its value in a society like ours that prizes more democratic and egalitarian relationships. The first thing I think to say here is that hierarchical relations are still present in our society. Students are still accountable to professors, professors to deans, workers to shop foremen and executives to governing boards. So even if accountability were only relevant to hierarchical relations involving authority, it would still have some importance in our society. However, it's not true that accountability is only applicable to hierarchical relations. And even within hierarchical relations that involve authority, it is almost always the case that accountability is reciprocal. My students are accountable to me as their professor, but I'm accountable to them as well. I can rightly expect them to write papers and essays as I assign them, but they can rightly expect me to grade their works fairly and conscientiously. They have a kind of standing, if not authority, and they have the right to ask me for an account. Why did I grade their papers as I did? Or why did I make the assignments that I made? So accountability is reciprocal even when there is an authority relationship. However, some of the most important accountability relationships are voluntary and hold between peers. A look around our culture shows a multitude of places where the virtue of accountability is sought or displayed. You might say hiding in plain sight. Think, for example, of the importance of small groups in contemporary church life, where groups of people commit to meet together weekly or monthly or whatever and share their lives with each other, holding each other accountable. Think of 12-step groups such as Alcoholics Anonymous or Celebrate Recovery, whose members commit to holding each other accountable. The virtue of accountability is so, in a way, obvious, it's even been commercialized. People find it so valuable to have what is called a, quote, accountability partner in seeking to achieve some goal, they're willing to pay good money, and you can find these people on the internet. You can find everything on the internet, I guess. So you can pay for an accountability partner. I don't recommend that as a way of getting an accountability partner, but I think it does show the value of this concept. Or we might think of egalitarian marriages in which husbands and wives seek a relationship not of domination but mutual submission. The concept of accountability can also be seen on full display in the business world. One of the things I love about this conference is the way so many disciplines, including business and everything else, are always on display here. But there is a full literature in the business world calling for business leaders and heads of nonprofits to work to develop what is called a culture of accountability. Much of this literature is inspired by the 1994 best-selling book, The Oz Principle, Getting Results Through Individual and Organizational Accountability. I have some criticisms of this book and others, but still I find this literature is helpful in emphasizing the idea that leaders should think of accountability as a positive quality to be nurtured, rather than simply as a process in which wrongdoers are punished. I conclude that accountability is a virtue that continues to be important in the contemporary world. Indeed, it may be especially important in our world, as I think many would agree with me that our society seems, if anything, excessively individualistic. We focus constantly on individual rights and happiness. We have a difficult time appreciating the value of community and the importance of the common good. Deepening our appreciation of what we owe to others, even as we struggle to become better, might help us recover something lost in the move from traditional to modern societies. In my concluding thoughts, I want to return to the fear of the Lord and what it means to be accountable to God. But before I move towards this goal, I want to say something about two other concepts related to accountability: the sense of accountability and the notion of global accountability. Many people, I believe, have a sense that they are accountable in some way for the whole of their lives and believe that that is in fact true. They are accountable. I shall term this kind of accountability global accountability. By this, I don't mean these people think they are responsible for the whole world or everything that happens, but rather that they think they are accountable for all they do, accountable for the whole of their lives. There's quite a lot of evidence that lots of people do have such a sense of global accountability. Now, one might expect this to be true for adherents of the Abrahamic faith, but it seems to be true for many Hindus and Buddhists, for example, who believe in karma, which could be seen as a kind of existential realization of accountability. And in our culture, for many non-religious people, people who don't have any religious beliefs, or at least formal ones, any call. You can see this in the way people behave. Think, for example, of a person who's received a bad medical diagnosis, and their first thought is, what did I do to deserve this? Have you ever heard that before? Or thought it yourself? Even though in some ways I think it's a mistaken thought, that is, it's badly mistaken to think that a medical ill is some kind of punishment. But the fact that our first impulse is sometimes to think that way shows how deeply ingrained in us is this idea that we're accountable for how we live our lives. A popular television show, The Good Place, and I noticed that Kristen Bell was here in Waco this week, the star of that show. The Good Place is built entirely around these four characters, all of whom are recently deceased, and none of them appear to have any recognizable religious beliefs. But after their death, they unhesitatingly accept the fact that they are going to be judged in a kind of karmic way for how they have lived their whole lives. And the show works. Nobody has trouble understanding or in a sense, entering into the plot. There's also survey research, some exhibited today at this conference, that shows a majority of Americans agree that they are accountable or responsible for their lives as a whole. Obviously, many secular people may dismiss the idea of global accountability, but not all of them. But I want to explore what it might mean to take this phenomenon seriously. How should we understand this sense or feeling that people are globally accountable in this way? I think there are at least three ways of understanding global accountability. The first can be seen in the great Abrahamic faiths, which hold that human persons are created by a good God, that one of God's purposes in creating humans is to make it possible for them to develop relationships to God, other persons, and the creation. All of this process relating to the building of what we might call character. Since God is the creator who has made humans and given them every good they have, God has a claim on their obedience and holds them accountable for living in accordance with his will, which is directed at their good. Religious people from these faiths, as well as others, see themselves as living before God. This way of understanding global accountability I call theistic accountability. On this kind of view, moral obligations themselves may be thought of as divine laws. Conscience is a God-given faculty whereby those laws are discerned, admittedly in a faulty way, because we're finite creatures who don't always get things right. The virtue in this case involves a kind of acceptance or welcoming of this experiential awareness of God's call or claim on humans, especially on oneself. A second way global accountability might be understood could be described as secular accountability. People who think of themselves as completely non-religious may still recognize the importance of accountability for human life. Some secular people recognize the value of accountability, but think they are accountable only to ourselves, or perhaps only to other people, or perhaps to both. There are, of course, important differences between those such as Kantians, who think of themselves as primarily accountable to themselves, and those such as social contract theorists who think of us as primarily accountable to other people. But basically all of this takes place within what we might call a secular framework. A third way of understanding global accountability can be found in people who are sometimes called spiritual but not religious. That, at least, is how such people are often described in research on religion, though I think a good case could be made that some of them, at least, could be better described as spiritual but not religious in a conventional sense. Many such people still have a sense that they are accountable or responsible for how they live their lives. A good example can be found in the writings of the late philosopher Ronald Dworkin. Dworkin rejected belief in God, but he still maintained that there's an important distinction to be made between happiness, understood as a life characterized by enjoyment, and what Dworkin called living well. Dworkin thought that most people understand that living well involves concern for others. We don't live well if we are purely egoistic and unconcerned about others' welfare. He claims that living well is not an option, but something we are responsible to do. I believe Dworkin here is using the term responsibility to designate what I'm calling accountability. He doesn't understand this responsibility as being accountable to a personal God, but he nonetheless sees accountability as a real and important feature of human life. Interestingly, Dworkin rejects what I'm calling secular accountability's view. He denies that we are responsible only to ourselves or even only to others, because if this were the case, we or those others could release ourselves from our responsibility. Dworkin claims that we cannot be released from being responsible. Our responsibility has a kind of metaphysical grounding that goes beyond human choices and decisions. I shall refer to this kind of spiritual but not traditionally religious understanding of accountability as metaphysical accountability. In the book that I'm writing, I also discuss karma as another example of metaphysical accountability. So these three ways of understanding global accountability are somewhat asymmetrical. Theistic and metaphysical accountability can fully recognize the importance of human accountability. Thus, they see no need to see human accountability in other forms as intention. However, the person who believes only in secular accountability can't fully accept the value of transcendent accountability. That's a term I use for, you might say, the conjunction of theistic and metaphysical. The theistic accountability and the metaphysical accountability both agree that there's some sort of higher transcendent principle that is the basis of the whole thing. The relationship between the two transcendent ways of understanding global accountability is also, I think, asymmetrical. The theistic account of accountability might view the person who thinks of accountability in metaphysical terms as someone who correctly perceives God's call in their lives. They have the sense of accountability, which is, in my terminology, what I would call a natural sign. Thanks for Todd for referring to my earlier book on that topic. It's a natural sign that points us towards God's reality in our experience. The theist can say that this person has recognized that they are accountable to God without realizing that it is in fact God to whom they are accountable. The theist can agree with the advocate of metaphysical accountability that there are principles or ideals for which we are accountable, but still think something important is missing if there is no one we are accountable to. Though I don't have time to make the case tonight, I believe that theistic understandings of accountability have distinct advantages over the other two kinds. I think that secular accounts of global accountability are just too thin. I agree with Dworkin that if I were only accountable to myself or other humans, I could be released from being accountable. Those I'm thought to be accountable to lack the requisite authority. I think metaphysical accountability does a good job of understanding what we are accountable for, but Dworkin's view that we can be responsible or accountable without there being anyone to whom we are accountable seems mysterious to me. On his view, the ground of our responsibility is what he calls the bare fact of our existence as conscious beings. But it's mysterious to me how the bare fact that I exist as a conscious being could be the ground of my accountability or responsibility. I want to turn now from generic theistic views of accountability to ask what Christians should think about global accountability. And I think Christians have distinctive views. Those who are Christian believers will see themselves not merely as accountable to God, but accountable to Christ, who died to redeem us and lives to make intercession for us. The debt of love that is the ground of accountability for Christians is deeper, since its ground does not merely stem from creation, but from the fact that we have been bought with a price. Christians will also have a plausible explanation for why the virtue of accountability is one that maybe isn't celebrated very much in our culture, as it should be. Christians believe we are sinful creatures, and one of the marks of sinful people is, quote, they love darkness rather than light. Darkness is a way of evading accountability, which demands transparency. The virtue of accountability may then be one that is fully realizable, at least Christians think, only through Christian faith. For it is through this faith that those of us who are Christians discover that God forgives us and accepts us as we are, not something we have to earn. It makes sense that we can open ourselves up and welcome accountability to a God who would live and die to make that possible. Somewhere, and I haven't been able to find the passage, I'm sorry to say, and I look for it, Jean-Paul Sartre says that God's existence, well, fortunately for Sartre, there is no God, but he says if there were a God, it would be intolerable. Because if there were a God, his gaze would be inescapable. There would be no place for us to hide. Sartre's comment shows how important it is, I think, for us to have the right concept of God if we believe we are accountable to God. Earlier, I claimed that one of the conditions for accountability to exhibit itself is that the one to whom a person is accountable to must be good and must care about the good of the one who's accountable. A God who is infinitely good obviously meets this condition. But if someone has the wrong view of God, this might appear not to be so. Popular versions of Christianity, even some theology, sometimes have seen God as someone who resembles Santa Claus, keeping a list of who is naughty and who is nice, and adjusting his favor and love in light of the list. If we think that God's forgiveness and grace and love are in some way conditional on human effort, then I think Sartre's view would not be completely wrong-headed at all. But I believe the biblical God's love is unconditional. As Paul says in 2 Corinthians 1, God's promises to us in Christ Jesus are not yes and no, but always yes. The gaze of a God whose grace and love are unconditional is a gaze that can be welcomed, not a gaze that we just have to endure. In Kierkegaard's Works of Love, he describes the gaze of a loving person who has overcome another person who has wronged the loving one, winning the wrongdoer for the good, but then also seeking reconciliation. And here is what the loving person, what Kierkegaard says about such a loving person. Would that I could describe how the one who loves looks at the one overcome, how joy beams from his eyes, how this loving look rests so gently on him, how it seeks, alluring and inviting to win him. Kierkegaard is describing a loving human person here rather than God, but his description surely is an apt image of the way God looks at sinners. Perhaps if Sartre had been able to picture God's gaze in this way, he would not have found it unendurable. Instead of thinking of God as a kind of cosmic snoop always ready to mete out punishment on those who have failed in their responsibilities, we might think of God's gaze as like the gaze of the father of the prodigal son in the parable that Jesus told, who saw his lost son when the son was still far away, and before the son had any opportunity to apologize and make amends for his misdeeds. The father, filled with compassion, ran to welcome the son, kissing him, putting his arms around him. It is, I think, a gift to be accountable to a God who is like that Father. In Christ we learn that God desires only our good and that his forgiveness and love are inexhaustible. There are no sins that can't be forgiven. Any barriers to reconciliation are barriers that we ourselves put up. When we understand God's love and embrace it, we will, I think, like the ancient psalmist, delight that we are accountable to God. We will see that the fear of the Lord is indeed the beginning of wisdom, the key to understanding ourselves and reality rightly. Thank you.
We have some time for just a few questions, so we got a microphone here, and if you'll raise your hand, and we'll come to you. Thank you so much for the terrific talks.
Thank you.
Two quick questions. One is, can you put this in a Trinitarian framework? Is it fair to speak of the Son's accountability to the Father, the Father's accountability to the Son? What does that look like? The flip side of that, is the virtue of accountability, as you're describing it, something that always teeters on the precipice of failure? Is it a preparedness to be responsible for our failures and answerable for them? Therefore, is it intrinsically somehow tied
Yeah. Okay. Being a bear of a little brain, I'm always hard when people ask two questions to remember the first question when I'm thinking of the second one.
The Father and the Son. The Father and the Son.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, yeah.
I should refer this to the theologians in the room, but all I will say is this, that on my view, I said this at one point in the thing, even, and it depends on your view of the Trinity, but even if you think there is there is clearly some asymmetry, there have to be some way of differentiating the persons of the Trinity. But it seems to me, even if you wanted to think of the Trinity in hierarchical terms, which I do not want to do, there could still be accountability, because accountability is always reciprocal, even when there is hierarchy. But I think when there is some sort of mutual accountability, even if there's differentiation of roles, then accountability is I have no. It is interesting, I think, that the scriptures say that Christ, as a human, learned accountability. He learned obedience. He developed, and so that seems to me to be important. On the other question, yes, I think, and I hinted at this, I think one of the things that we learn when we realize that we are accountable to God for the whole of our lives is that we are pretty bad at it. We're pretty bad at it. We fail all the time. The way Kierkegaard likes to think of this, he says that our relationship to Christ always has a kind of dual aspect. We come to Christ first as the one who atones and redeems, who forgives and accepts. But when we are forgiven and redeemed, we owe him a debt, and we want to be obedient to him and follow him, and we are renewed. And of course, we fail again, and then we have to have Christ as the atonement, as the Redeemer. So there's a kind of mutual dialectic here, a kind of rhythm that occurs. And I don't see any reason in this life why that process doesn't go on and on. But I think what makes it tolerable, more than tolerable, what makes it joyful is that we are always, in a sense, resting on the fact that it's God who is embracing us, not we are fundamentally embracing God. He is the one who is, God's covenant with us is not like a business contract where the two sides of the contract both have to do their part or the whole thing is blown. God's covenants are established by God. That's at least my understanding of this. And I think one of the beauties of accountability and the reasons why we need to understand its value or importance is that's exactly what we need when we screw up. We need someone to help us do better, who can give us useful feedback just in our human relationships. And so, in a way, it's a great gift to be accountable to someone who wants you to succeed and will point out to you where you've gone wrong and how you can do better. Faithful are the wounds of a friend, including if that friend is your boss. Okay, thanks for those questions. In the back, I see a hand. I think that's Justin Bernard back there.
Tell us who you are, Justin.
Yeah, Justin Barnard from Union University. Thank you for your talk. I wonder if you could say just a few words about the relationship between the virtue of accountability and charity, the virtue of love. I guess part of what I find myself wondering is whether perfection in charity entails that the virtue of accountability goes away, or is it the perfection of accountability once love is perfected? Or is it just that perfection in love is the perfection of accountability, the virtue of accountability?
Well, that's a great question. I'm inclined to think that certainly in human relationships, you can have accountability without love. That's obvious. And you can have what we might call a healthy accountability relationship, where you just have a sort of professional relationship with someone you're accountable to, but they do their job well, and you do your job as a county well, and they're helpful to you, and you're helpful to them. But maybe it doesn't amount to love, at least not in any emotional. You might have love only in the sense of respect for them as human beings, and they have that for you. But in relationship to God, things are clearly going to be different. And I think the goal should be love. And it may be that accountability is in some way, you might say, a virtue for this life. Kierkegaard, in his great book, Works of Love, throughout the book emphasizes the idea that love is a duty, that we have an obligation to love, that we're commanded to love. We're commanded not just to love, but to love our neighbors as ourselves, where every human being is our neighbor. But in the very last chapter of the book, he hints, by reflecting on one of the epistles of John, not John's gospel, he hints that perhaps if we were perfected in love, we wouldn't have to be commanded to love. It wouldn't be a duty anymore. And maybe in some ways, the need for accountability that's a virtue that reflects our imperfect state. Even faith is supposed to be something that maybe is a virtue for this life. So that's not putting accountability in bad company, but that's my best guess there.
One final question?
Hi there, Casey Spinks. Thank you very much for your talk. And I was just curious how an element of timeliness would fall into your understanding of accountability, because it seems to me that a very important aspect of distinctly Christian theism, and Kierkegaard picks this up throughout his works as well, is that the idea that time is short and time is running out. And so I'm wondering, how your understanding of time and temporality in this life, even as we kind of relate to these more eternal concepts that you highlight in this talk, how those concepts of time relate.
Boy, that's a great question, and I'm sure I haven't thought enough about that to answer it well. I would say there are probably two errors to be avoided here. One is the error of thinking that since our lives are finite and we only have so much time and we have this great task given to us, that we have to sort of be frantically busy. And that seems to be a mistake. And Kierkegaard talks about busyness as a vice. And so that's important. On the other hand, there is clearly got to be a sense in which we should be redeeming the time. When we should be saying, we only have so much time given to us, and we want to use it well and live it well for the God who created us. So, even in human relationships, there clearly is going to be a sense in which timeliness is going to be important. When do I have to give that report or that account? Or if I'm the person someone is giving an account to, when do I offer the feedback? When it will be most useful? And when can I offer it at a place that won't be hurtful or devastating or to the person that I'm giving it to? How can I do that in a way that they can appreciate my good intentions? So those are some of the things that I would say, but really great question. Thank you.
On that note, do you want me to